Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday. Today we are in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building at 555 South 10th in Lincoln. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's website at www.nebraskahistory.org. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine, and you get the Society's newsletter. Use of a microfilm reader printer in the Society's library and archives to make free copies of microfilm. Free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites. Discounts in the Society's landmark stores at the History Museum, the State Capitol, and Chimney Rock. And reduced fees for kids' classes. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television across Nebraska and on the Society's YouTube webpage. To find that webpage, just type www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Into your browser search, there are over 130 past brown bags on YouTube. Our speaker today is Jamison Wyatt, and his topic is Stalking the Ghost of Maury Sandoz. By the way, I just see there's a publication of the Maury Sandoz Heritage Society, The Story Catcher. And there's a nice story about a Jamison in there. And I'll have this around if any of you'd like to look at that. Jamison is a legislative aide for the Nebraska legislature. He studied history at the University of Nebraska. His personal research explores the life of Maury Sandoz while she lived in Lincoln from 1920 to 1940. He currently lives in the Shirtliff Arms, the apartment building where Sandoz wrote much of her allegorical novel, Capital City. Jamison gives numerous talks on Sandoz and local history around Lincoln. Just to let you know about questions, Jamison says to ask them anytime. Please join me in welcoming Jamison Wyatt.
Good afternoon. So, show of hands, who here has read any of Sandoz before? Yeah, very good, very good. So Maury Sandoz is probably best remembered for the biography of her father, Jules Sandoz, the title of that biography, Old Jules. Old Jules was published in 1935 when Maury was 39 years old. And Old Jules really helped to launch Maury's career as a successful professional writer. From this point on, 1935, until her death at the age of 69, March 10, 1966, which was precisely 50 years ago, just last week, she would go on to have published 2 additional biographies, 6 major histories of the American West, 7 novels, and over 40 short stories and articles. But before Old Jules, before 1935, Sandoz was this prototypical starving artist who suffered through a long and grueling apprenticeship. And Stalking the Ghost of Maury Sandoz is my exploration of this apprenticeship period of Sandoz's, right, where she's struggling to become a successful writer, specifically while she lived here in our capital city. And she lived here off and on from 1919 through the publication of Old Jules in 1935 on up to 1940 when she moved on to Denver. And we're going to start our haunting, our stalking, by using our imagination here for just a minute. And back away from 1935 to May of 1922. And imagine yourself on the far eastern edge of the University of Nebraska City campus. And what we find before us is Teachers College Hall, which some of you may recognize today as the north half of the Canfield Administration Building. Of course, that's not the far eastern edge of campus any longer, but it was in 1922. And I like to imagine Sandoz standing right here before the building. She climbs up the steps, she passes through the main portal, and she walks down the first floor corridor to the south central stair. And she ascends the stair. And between the second and third levels, she pauses at the landing, and she finds this large picture window, and she gazes through the panes onto the city of Lincoln. And just down the street from Teachers College, just down 14th Street, she sees a familiar building, the Lincoln Business College. It was in 1919 that Mari and her cousin, Rosalie Sandoz, traveled from their native Sheridan County, Nebraska, 400 miles here to the city to attend the college. We can actually see a picture of Mari here on the left with her cousin Rosalie Sandoz, taken about a year later here in Lincoln. So the two, again, travel from Sheridan County to the big city to attend the Lincoln Business College. And that business college, at least the building, is still around today. And you may recognize the building here as Raising Cane's downtown on the northwest corner of 14th and P Streets. And the business college actually still exists itself. We just no longer call it the Lincoln Business College. And this picture, which was taken several years later after Mari attended in 33, you can see at the top of the image it says the Lincoln School of Commerce, which went through a few more evolutions and is today Kaplan University over by the Capitol on K Street. When Mari and Rosalie attended the college here for a solid 8 months, they took courses on the second floor of this structure, secretarial courses, learning how to type, learning shorthand and dictation. And these are all skills that would benefit Mari later on in her fledgling writing career. She would type up her manuscripts. She would use her dictation skills to give historical interviews and so forth. And after she attended the business college here, she would go on to return to the Panhandle and teach rural school. And actually kind of acts an act of defiance. When she was 17 years old, Mari ran away from home to take the rural teacher's examination in Sheridan County. And she passed the test. She received a third grade teaching certificate, or a third class teaching certificate. And she went on to have a short teaching career in Sheridan County. And from an early age, prior to becoming a teacher, Mari always thought she wanted to become a writer. But writing was prohibited in the Sandoz household. That didn't really stop her much. When she was 11 years old, she had a short story, a fairy tale really, called The Broken Promise, published in the Omaha Daily News. And when her father, old Jules Sandoz, found out about the story, he beat Mari and banished her to the root cellar, where all the bull snakes were crawling around. So again, writing was prohibited. But attending the business college could benefit Mari twofold. It could help her with her writing career, her secret writing career at this point, and then it also would benefit her with her teaching career, which was active at this time. Back in Nebraska in these days, if you took sections of the rural teacher's examination over, you could improve your grade and get a higher classification on your rural teaching certificate. So she attends business college. She's still teaching at this point, and we can kind of picture her still standing in Teachers College Hall on that landing, looking at the window, thinking about these things. And also from this vantage point in Teachers College Hall, looking through this window, she looks off into the horizon and she sees the Nebraska State Capitol, which in 1922 looked a little bit different. This is the Nebraska State Capitol in 1922, this Renaissance revival completed by the state of Nebraska in 1888. But in 1922, really in the 19-teens, this building had not only been outgrown by the state of Nebraska, but it was starting to rapidly decay. So actually in 1919, the state legislature created a capital commission to oversee construction of a new third state capitol building. The commission held an architectural competition, selected the architect from New York, Bertram Goodhue, to design a new third state capitol building, and those plans would have been unveiled in 1920. Again, this whole planning process for a new capitol began just the previous year when Mari first came to Lincoln to attend the business college. So she always kind of found a personal connection with the Capitol building. When the Capitol plans were unveiled, I think some early critics thought the building was quite freakish, right? We're taking away that invariable Roman dome and replacing it with this big, tall tower. But Mari loved the Capitol plan. She thought it was bold and fresh, and she closely followed the development, the construction of the Capitol building, just as her own personal development, her own apprenticeship was taking place, right? Struggling to become this writer. And the two almost kind of go hand in hand from beginning to completion. The Capitol building, if we get real nitty gritty, was completed in 1934. That is with like the finishing touches of carving some of the exterior sculpture. And in 1935, just a year later, that's when Sandoz achieved success with that publication of Old Jewels. So we'll kind of return to themes of the Capitol as we go. But let's return first back to Teachers College. So she's thinking about all of these things, the business college before her, the Capitol on the horizon of this view. And she turns away from the view and she continues up the steps to the third floor. She's walking down to room 302. She's there to see Dean William E. Seelock, Dean of the Teachers College. And she again has this rationale that if she attends the University of Nebraska now, she can benefit either her writing career or her teaching career. So she must be enrolled at the university. But the problem Sandoz was facing is that she never attended high school. High school, of course, being a prerequisite for admittance into the University of Nebraska. People told her that she should attend the university high school in Temple, the Temple building, Temple High. But she was a teacher herself. She'd been teaching off and on for 8 solid years. She was a mature 26-year-old, and so she wasn't going to go to high school with a bunch of high schoolers, right? She wanted to attend the university. And so she went from dean's office to dean's office, begging to be admitted, and everyone turned her away, even the dean of women, But she was walking around campus apparently and it stopped a passerby and said, "Who is the softest-hearted dean on the campus?" And the reply was, "Well, that's Dean Seelock." So she's here at Teachers College to make her case before Dean Seelock. But Dean Seelock had a gatekeeper, as Mari put it, a hard-boiled secretary. And Sandoz asked to see the dean, and the dean's secretary wasn't going to allow Mari to see him. So she just kind of sat down in front of his office in an act of defiance, waiting to see the dean. When the dean passed by, he asked the secretary, "Oh, is this young woman here to see me?" And the secretary said, "Oh, no, she's just here to see a friend." And apparently this episode repeated itself several times. She went day after day after day staking out at Dean Seelock's office until finally one day he walked by and he looked at Mari and he said, "Well, you are here to see me, aren't you?" She said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, come on back." And so she made her case and he said, "Well, that's not a problem at all. I'll enroll you, and if you fail, you fail. And if you don't fail and you never ask for any credits, well, that will be just fine." And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And Mari never received a degree from the University of Nebraska, at least in this time period. Later on, she would receive an honorary degree in literature from the university in 1950. But she was enrolled in, as was termed, an adult special, and she began Teachers College coursework in Teachers College Hall in 1922. Be June 5th, 1922, or when those summer courses began. She would then return to Sheridan County to teach another school session and rural schools, and then she would return to Nebraska in 1923, take additional summer courses, and then in fall of 1923, she enrolled for her first regular session of coursework. And by this time, the writing bug is really starting to itch Mari, and she's taking social sciences courses in Social Sciences Hall, which we can see in this next slide. This is 12th and R Streets, which we recognize the building on the right, what we now today know as CBA on campus, or at least CBA for now until the new building is finished. But this was Social Sciences Hall. You can maybe see it actually says Social Sciences there. And that's where a lot of these social sciences classes are taking place. Her writing classes in English with Dr. Louise Pound, and her courses in short story writing with what became a good friend of hers, Melvin Vandenbark. And she would continue to take classes here and in other places across the campus, off and on for several more sessions. But she was a poor ranch and farm girl from Sheridan County. She had to pay her own way through college. And the same year that she began her regular session coursework, fall 1923, she took a part-time job at Smith Dorsey Drug Factory. So this is the drug factory here on South 10th Street. And this building still exists today. We just don't recognize it. In the 1940s, an addition was put onto the building on the left side, the south side, and it was given a nice kind of Art Deco curve. And later on, it became the police station. So that's on, 10th and M Streets on that northwest corner. But 1923, this is how Smith Dorsey looked. Mari took a job filling capsules with various powders and concoctions. The pay was 25 cents for every single 1,000 capsule cycle that could fill. She was lucky if she could make 25 cents an hour. But she claimed later on that she somehow worked enough hours, half days from noon to 5:30, holidays, Saturdays, that she could scrape by $35 a month to help pay for her tuition, her books, and her board. She, again, hated filling capsules, though, and so later on she was allowed under strict supervision to mix some of the potions. She had a family history involved with medicine. Her father, old Jules, before he immigrated to Nebraska from Switzerland, had actually trained to be a doctor. And so he had medical books in the ranch in Sheridan County and different medicines and potions that she was familiar with. So mixing potions herself at the Smith Dorsey Drug Company was extremely interesting to her. And we can see what looks to be like a lab scene also here from Smith Dorsey. But we can't see Sandoz. Later on, Sandoz would take employment through her teacher friend, Melvin Vandenbark. I mentioned earlier that he was her short story instructor. He taught her everything she knew about writing. And she took a job with him to help run the short story courses after she took the initial one in 1925. And she also became a reader for his freshman English papers. And Mari, though, was a very serious person, but she could also have some fun as well. And in this next picture, we can see Mari with some friends out hiking. Mari loved to go on hikes. She loved to take the streetcar down West O to Capitol Beach and ride the roller coaster. She liked to also kind of play some trickster games. She always wore a hat. Her mother told her that no self-respecting woman ever leaves the house without a hat on. But sometimes she would take her hat off, place it in the middle of the road, hide behind a bush, and then when a passerby would pick her hat up, she would pop out of the bush and said, "Oh, you found my hat." And she, I guess, thought that was entertaining. So Mari also was a bit of a mystic. She liked to read fortunes and palms, and she also liked a lot of tall tale and myth. And Mari had a theory about myth and where it originates. In Love Song to the Plains, she wrote, "In times of extreme privation and hardship, of great public unease or after a war, when people refuse to face the dull realities of peace, they build fairy tales for themselves, tall tales. And if the times are right, these can run over the nation like prairie fire in a high wind." The summer and fall of 1923, Nebraska began to originate some of its own tall tales and myths. World War I had been over for several years, but the overproduction of wheat was still taking place, and eventually that wheat bubble burst, and Nebraska went into a recession as the wheat prices began to drop. So it's, again, from this point of reference that Nebraska gets its big tall tale myth from Sheridan County, her home county, out at Alkali Lake. Also in Love Song to the Plains, she wrote, "A picture was displayed in the large center window of McGee's store in Lincoln. A crowd pushed up to see the photograph of a lake with an old truck off to the side, and resting on the water was a dragon-like creature at least 10 times as long as the truck. A university student elbowed in to see and, surprised, exclaimed in a needlessly loud voice, 'That's a fake! That's a picture of a sandhill water puppy superimposed on the lake picture.'" Sandhill water puppy, of course, being a salamander, and that young university student exclaiming that it's a fake is surely Mari Sandoz herself. She always liked to seek the truth, and she thought things like this Alkali Lake monster, a supposed relative of the famous Loch Ness monster, she always thought things like this deserved a careful look, a careful second look even. And actually, when Mari was a young girl out in Sheridan County, Buffalo Bill stopped by the Sandoz Ranch for a visit, and he spent the night. And Mari was given the task to wake Buffalo Bill the following morning. And she would write, "There was no reply to my knock, and finally I pushed the door open a crack. Evidently Bill had gone duck hunting with my father, for the bed was empty, but on the bedpost that handsome head of curling hair. And that one moment I learned something of disillusionment and something of the need for a second look, always a careful second look." So, moral of the story there, Buffalo Bill had fake hair. So, but maybe Mari herself deserves a careful second look. Mari's hair had secrets of its own. Mari was blonde, but after she moved to Lincoln, she became various shades of red. Sometimes she would get her mixtures of hair dye a little wrong, and she was even purple sometimes. Mari also kind of she was a short woman. She was 5'5", but she always appeared much taller. So there's almost like a myth about how tall she actually was. But she always appeared much taller because, starving, struggling artist, she was extremely malnourished. She oftentimes said, "I'd rather read than eat." And oftentimes she would read instead of eat, or write instead of eat. And then later on, when she would send out all of her manuscripts to the Eastern publishers, she spent all of her money to purchase stamps to send those short stories and articles out. And because she was so malnourished, there were times when Mari weighed maybe 90 pounds. So this very slender woman with kind of a lumbering gait, again, always appeared much taller than what she actually was. And when she enrolled at the university in 1922, she oftentimes claimed that she was 21 years old. As I mentioned earlier, though, 1922, Sandoz was in fact 26. So she was always lying about her age, which, as her sister would later say, apparently that's a woman's prerogative to lie about her age. And when she enrolled at the university with the registrar's office, she actually enrolled stating that she attended Sheridan County High School, which we know she never attended high school, and also there's no such thing as Sheridan County High School. And she also claimed that she attended Chadron Normal College, which is also not true. And she signed her name at registration time as Marie Alice Suzetta Maycumber. Now, Marie, that's not unusual. She was known as Marie among her family and friends, or Mary, or later Mari. Alice, however, was a completely invented middle name. She had never been known as Alice until 1922. Suzetta, that was her given middle name, except she altered the spelling at the university. And Maycumber, that's not Sandoz. It's a funny surname, but it wasn't invented. Mari had been married, but a lot of people never knew that. Mari actually married a Sheridan County homesteader in 1914, kind of right at the beginning of World War I. And the marriage proved to be her own personal war. And in 1919, she filed for divorce, citing cruel mental abuse. And in August of 1919, the divorce was granted. And although divorce was actually fairly common in the Sandhills at this time, her mother wasn't too pleased that she had a divorced daughter in the family. So she had to deal with her mother and then, the local gossip that comes with being a divorcee. And again, she also had these dreams of either continuing on as a teacher or becoming a writer. And so that's when she escapes to Lincoln in 1919 with cousin Rosalie to attend the business college. And in the 1920 Lincoln City Directory, we actually see her name here as Mrs. Marie Maycomber. So early on, she still has the Mrs. title. She eliminates that, though, after this publication of the city directory. She was, from that point on, known as Miss Marie Maycomber. And again, she always hid the fact that she had been married and divorced, and she would write off her last name, Maycomber, as being a pen name, right? This was to shield herself from her disapproving family, the family who prohibited her from writing, which that's a bit tricky because they knew that she had been married as Maycomber, right? And we can see that she was a student at LBC, Lincoln Business College. But what's also unusual here is we see her husband, Ray Maycomber. That's who she was married to. Why is he in the Lincoln City Directory? And the answer to that question is I have no idea. I highly doubt that he followed her after the divorce to Lincoln, but here he is anyway. And if we would flip through the pages and find the Sandoz entry, we would see Rosalie Sandoz also listed as boarding at 457 North 25th Street. So we can presume, and back up here, she did live, in fact, with her cousin Rosalie. But we can presume from this entry that this was probably where Mari first lived here in the city with or without Ray Maycomber. Mari also would board at... You have a question? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Mari would also board at 1948 K Street. She would board at 1136 K Street. And then in 1925, she sought a more permanent residence at 1226 J Street, which is just down the street from where we are today, except we call J Street Lincoln Mall. This house has been torn down, though. The house was torn down in the 1950s to make way for the new, Nebraska Farmers Mutual Insurance Building, which is now the old insurance building. But it was located there on the north side of J Street. This is the Boston House. And Mari lived here off and on for 12 years until 1937. She lived on the second floor. The Boston family lived on the first floor. That was where the owners of the home. And her first apartment was a small little closet, basically. And she took great pride in wallpapering her room, and she made it nice and homey and cozy. Rent was $8, and she oftentimes had lots of artist friends and writers that she was making friends with at the university. She'd have them come over, and they would read American Mercury and read Ulysses, which was banned at the time. And they would talk about serious things, about art and so forth. And in the late 1920s, Mari began writing a novel, an autobiographical novel called Murky River. And she has a little episode from time spent in the Boston house with some of her artist friends. She wrote, "Slowly, Endor," who is Mari Sandoz in this novel, "slowly Endor gathered a group of young revolutionaries, such as the university afforded, about her. Often they came to her room in twos, threes, and more, and they talked. Usually they tried to draw her into the conversation. Usually she held aloof, correcting papers, covering her assignments until some remark challenging her drifted through the detachment. Then, with a cigarette between her lips, she joined in the discussions and made the same overgo. Somehow these young intellectuals always listened, for while they theorized about life and death, they sensed that she had seen some of these things." I really like that that image especially of the cigarette between her lips. Yes, Mari smoked. Mari drank. In the 1920s, during Prohibition, she'd oftentimes have some homemade wild grape wine. And these stories of smoking and drinking wine and having men into a woman's apartment, these stories filtered back to the university, and surely the university kind of frowned upon these activities, but Mari was a rebel. And again, she was a serious rebel. And when it was time to say goodbye to her friends, she'd kick them to the curb. And she'd put her busy sign on her doorknob, and it was time to write. And if it ever got too hot and stuffy inside the Boston house, she'd just go outside, take a break, stand in the middle of J Street, and look to the left, look to the east, and find the Capitol, which again at this point is under construction. And these are almost at the end of construction. We can still see a crane on the image to the left there. These were probably taken by Sandoz herself, taken right in front of the Boston house. And she would also find a seat at the curb on J Street. She could still see the Capitol down the street. And she would write a letter later about her experiences on the J Street curb. She wrote, "Today I sit on the J Street curb with my writing board on my knee and have the situation so completely in hand that only out-of-town cars slow down to look upon the freak in the sun. And by staring right back, I can easily break their confidence and make them hurry on, usually to miss the stop sign on 13th Street and the fine view of the Capitol Tower half a block down." So again, the Capitol is extremely important to her as she writes about the Capitol again and again and again and again. But she can't just write all of the time. She still has to support herself. And in July of 1927, she finds employment at the University Publishing Company. We can see the publishing company here. This building was located, I should say, about where the stage of the Lead Center is located on Q Street. This was 1126 Q Street. And she worked in editorial office of the school executive magazine here, and she was paid handsomely, $75 a month. And while she was working at the publishing company, she would spend evenings and weekends writing, and by this point she's quickly amassing lots of short stories and articles. She would claim later on that within her files she eventually had anywhere from 78 to 85 short stories and articles. And she was beginning to have at this time a bit of success. Actually, in 1927, Lowry Wimberly of the University of Nebraska was launching this new literary magazine called Prairie Schooner. And Mari was given the honor of having the very first story on the very first page of the very first issue. Again, January 1927. The short story was entitled The Vine, largely an autobiographical tale of her marriage period. There was a vine this woman was taking care of in the sandhills, feeding it lots of water which had been hauled from the river over several miles, and her husband finds out that she's been watering the vine, and he beats her and rips up the vine, and that's the end of the story. And also in August of 1926, backing up a year before Prairie Schooner, she won honorable mention in the Harper Intercollegiate Literary Contest. Jules Sandoz would find out that she won this honorable mention for writing. And he, in turn, wrote a note to Mari, and it said, "You know, I consider writers and artists the maggots of society." So even from 400 miles away, old Jules was still shaming her. But in November of 1928, Jules was on his deathbed in Alliance, and she took the train to Alliance, was with old Jules in the hospital by his bedside, and right before he passed, he kind of came to, saw Mari in the room, and said, "You still live in Lincoln, right?" And she said, "Yes." "You still write, don't you?" And she wasn't going to lie to him, and she said, "Yes." And he said, "Write my story." So he released her, basically. He gave her the permission that she always needed from her family to seek her passion, to write. And from that day forward, she would have to grapple with this big project of writing his biography, which again ultimately was published as Old Jules in 1935. After Old Jules dies, about a year later, Mari Sandoz is fed up with her employer at the University Publishing Company. It was a magazine, the school executive magazine, which promoted mediocrity, thought Mari. And she thought that was the biggest sin that you could live by, mediocrity. And so she abruptly quits, August 1929. And she's going to write full-time now. She finds a literary agent out of New York named Margaret Christie. They have a tumultuous relationship which lasted about a year. Christie really couldn't get any of Mari's works published, with some small exceptions. But one lasting thing that Margaret Christie does give to Mari Sandoz is Mari Sandoz. She recommended that at this point, Marie Maycomber change her name to Mari Sandoz. Has a better ring to it. And from that day forward, at least professionally, Mari Sandoz was known as Mari Sandoz. And this is also kind of a tricky period. We're getting into the beginning of the Depression. Mari still wants to write, and she's attempting to write full time. But she, again, is always needing to find employment. And there was an opportunity in Nevada to take a full-time teaching job out there. She was to go out there in February of 1930, and that was her plan, or so she claimed. But on December 30th, 1929, her bank, the Alliance State Bank, failed, and she was left with $1.83, not enough money to make the trip to Nevada. So she stayed in Lincoln and struggled on. And at this point, she's struggling on with her novel, Murky River, which she's at this point starting to send out to publishers, and she's beginning her research of the biography of her father, Old Jules. Now, at this time, the Historical Society had its stuff, its belonging, its holdings scattered all across the city. They had archival material in the basement of what we now know as Architecture Hall, then the University Library. They had contents in the basement of Social Sciences Hall, of Bessie Hall, and they also had contents in the basement of a building which was supposed to look, oops, I missed this one here. This is just Mari Sandoz in 1929, as she's now affirmed her name as Mari Sandoz. And actually that corner of the building there is the Old City Hall, the old post office on O Street. So there's Mari wearing her hat. But as I was mentioning, the Historical Society also had some of its archival materials in the basement of, well, not this building, but this is what the building was supposed to look like. In the early 1900s, the state legislature appropriated funds for a proper historical museum and library. And the proposed site was right across the street from the Capitol on the northeast corner of 16th and H, which today is just a surface parking lot where senators and judges park. This is what the building was supposed to look like, but this is all that was ever built. You can see the Historical Society half-block sign. And if we turn the corner, we find the entrance to this partial basement of a structure. And the Historical Society housed much of its newspaper collection in this basement, and that was a lot of her source material, the newspapers from western Nebraska. There was very little ventilation, really no natural light in here, so we can imagine Mari clomping down these steps just inside these doors, wearing galoshes and towing a flashlight, searching through these damp and musty files. And it's at this point in time that she really starts to get to know the staff at the Historical Society. She becomes friends with Addison Sheldon, who is the superintendent of the Historical Society. And in addition to doing her own personal research on Old Jules, she eventually begins to do research for Sheldon himself, research on Red Cloud. And she also was assisting her friend from the university, Eleanor Hinman, in research of a different American Indian, Crazy Horse. In 1930, Eleanor Hinman and Mari, this is in July of 1930, They took an old Ford up to the Indian country, to the reservations, Pine Ridge and so forth. And their mission was to interview the old-timers about the life of Crazy Horse. And we can actually see a picture of Mari and Eleanor Hinman here in Lincoln just before they take off on their journey in 1930 to the reservations. As a result of this trip, they were gone for about a month. Mari proposed to the Eastern publishers a magazine article idea about their trip. And she had a proposed title that was attached to that magazine idea called Stalking the Ghost of Crazy Horse. And the article was never written, nor was it ever published then. But I have taken her title and reappropriated it for my purposes, and I use it all the time. So that's our talk here today, Stalking the Ghost of Mari Sandoz. And where are we here? Okay, so Mari's doing lots of research. She's doing lots of writing. And by 1930, 1931, she's kind of rounding the corner on her research with Old Jewels, and she begins to actually write the biography. And after she has her drafts finished, she heads to the Cornhusker Hotel, which we can see the Cornhusker Hotel here, the old Cornhusker Hotel on the left-hand side of the photograph. And that's where she would hang out and type a lot of her manuscripts. Mari hated the Lincoln climate. It was too hot and humid here in the summers for her. So she sought refuge here because the building was air-conditioned. It was air-conditioned from the day it opened in 1925. So a nice luxury for Mari. And Mari also would spend time in the cafe at the Cornhusker Hotel. More of her artist and writer friends would join her there. They had a booth that was theirs. They called it the Agony Corner, and they would, again, talk more about serious matters, the goings-on of the university and art trends and writing trends and so forth. And if they ever got tired of drinking their coffee and smoking their cigarettes at the Cornhusker, they would just go right across the street to the new bus station, which we can recognize that old bus station there, that parking garage. There was the Night and Day Cafe, which was apparently open 24 hours, and they could drink their coffee there as well. And all the while, the Capitol building is still under construction. And in 1930, Sandoz herself witnessed this event, the raising of the finial of the state capitol, the statue we call the Sower. She would write to a friend in Sheridan County, "Sorry you couldn't see the ascent of the Sower to his permanent place of business. You might have liked it. Everyone except the blind, including the halt and the dumb, were there. With a giant crane on the tower and several steel cables, the chap started his chief rise in life, turning gracefully to left and to right, as though scattering dormant life to all the winds. The morning sun red on his magnificent bronze chest. And suddenly a veritable cloud, including surely every dove in town, swirled about the tower, greeting the Sower. I'd like to fancy. It was certainly symbolic if accidental, and behind it all, the blue, Nebraska blue sky, the tower, a pedestal of silver." How many doves did you see in that clip? Oh, I don't know. Maybe there were no doves. Maybe there were. So the Capitol is nearing completion. Sandoz is completing her biography, Old Jewels, and 1931, 1932, she begins to send it to the publishers. And again, and again, and again, and again, she's getting rejection. And by this point, she's still with the, well, let me hear, where am I going here? Uh-oh. How do I do it? I'm stuck. There's a nice picture of the Capitol. I'll just pause with this. Here we have the Capitol. Here is the half lot where the basement was with the Historical Society. Her house is right here at the time, 1226 J Street. There, of course, is the Capitol. We can see the Cornhusker Hotel there at the top of the image. So again, she's struggling to get Old Jewels published. And in 1933, everything really starts to go south. She had entered the Old Jewels manuscript to the Atlantic Monthly contest for nonfiction. She got a rejection after the contest held the manuscript for like 7-8 months. So she gets this real big blow in 1933. She's not getting anything published, really. And so in an act of defiance, an act of theatrics, she invites a couple of friends over behind her house. She takes a big wash bin out into the alley. She throws in all of her short stories and articles. She lights a match and sets them on fire. She's done writing. And she returns to Sheridan County to live with Mom, to eat proper food and get some meat on her bones. At least this is what she's claiming she's done writing. But of course, while she's in Sheridan County back at home, she builds a little shack for herself and she starts writing again. And she actually starts writing a novel called Slocum House, which was published as her second book. It was published in 1937, kind of a filthy, smutty book. At least that's how it was viewed at the time. It was really a book about the will to power. It was kind of a book about fascism. Mari was extremely concerned what was going on in Germany with the rise of Hitler at the time, and so there's some of those themes that we find in Slocum House, but there's also naughty language and talk about prostitution, and eventually Slocum House would be banned by the Omaha Public Library and the McCook Library and other libraries across the country. So again, she's kind of planting the seeds for Slocum House and working on Slocum House in 1933 back at home. So she's still writing. And then she realizes that she's really in the middle of nowhere. The mail is slow. She doesn't have all of her resources at the Historical Society at hand back in Lincoln. And so Addison Sheldon, the Historical Society superintendent, writes to Mari, says, hey, I have this great thing for you, a job. You can come back and work full-time at the Historical Society. And that's exactly what she did. Sheldon hired her through the Civil Works Administration to continue researching for jewels, and then eventually, as funding changed through the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, she became Director of Personnel and then later editor of the Historical Society publication, Nebraska History. And here's an image of the museum, which was located in the Capitol at the time, so she would have taken people through the museum off and on. And we see Mari next in the basement of the Capitol in Vault 67. There she is in the background there, supervising people processing newspapers. This is kind of a famous photograph maybe some of you have seen before. And then we also see her name on the cover of Nebraska History. Addison E. Sheldon is there at the top as editor, and then Mari Sandoz there as the associate editor. Now, Mari still hasn't given up completely on her dreams of getting Old Jewels published. And she oftentimes, in bits of frustration, will head up to the 14th floor of the Capitol building to what she called the Hall of Heroes. And she didn't really like this room too much. She thought it was too scary. But what the 14th floor did offer was a nice view on the observation decks. And here she would watch the city go by. She would maybe think about jumping off. She would later joke that she was so frustrated of working on Old Jewels that after about a year of writing, she thought she should just fling herself off the Capitol, but she realized that it wouldn't really improve the book too much. And suicide was something very common in this era and right around her as well. In January of 1935, a man named Dan Helwig actually jumped off the Capitol building right past her window on the 9th floor of the tower where the Historical Society had its office. So these were things that were always very present in her mind, but she persisted, and she continued to send out Old Jewels to the publishers. And one last time, she entered Old Jewels in that Atlantic contest. And in June of 1935, when she's at her desk at the Capitol on the 9th floor, she receives a telegram. And the telegram tells her that she won the contest. She not only won the contest, Old Jewels was going into print, and she'd also win $5,000. So she was achieving success. Her apprenticeship is finally over. She's published now, and she has lots of cash. And then later on, Old Jules would win a Book of the Month Club recognition, and she won an additional $5,000. And from this point on, she would go on to write and write and write and write and write. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Slocum House was her next work published. And after Slocum House was published in 1937, she thought, I need a more proper place to live, a bigger place to live. So she left the Boston house. There's Sandoz after she won the award in 1935. And she moved to the Shirtliff Farms, which John mentioned earlier. This is where I live. I don't live in her actual apartment unit. I live just down one level. But she lived in the southeast corner, what we see, the upper left corner behind the tree, at Shirtliff Farms 402. And it was here in Shirtliff Farms that she would write much of Capital City, kind of a satire of the city of Lincoln, and always present in the novel was the Capitol Tower itself. People didn't like Capital City. They thought it was a little too harsh about Lincoln. And from this point on, people would try to get into Mari's apartment. She got death threats. Eventually her apartment was broken into. And it's probably easy to say that Lincoln ran her out of town. And so she moved away in 1940. But she restored her relationship with Lincoln, and she would come back to the city several times. She would do this new thing called television and do interviews for the Historical Society in the 1950s. And so she again restored her ties with the city. But that's really the only place that's left where Sandoz lived at one time here in the city. But there you go. There's the life of Sandoz and Lincoln. We stalked her ghost. I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys may have. No? Mr. Ripley.
Can you remind me again what year she won her first literary award?
What year did Mari win her first literary award? Well, she won her first literary mention, honorable mention, in 1926. And then Old Jules, the big prize, was 1935. So. Yes?
Mr. Bray, the author, the definitive author of Crazy Horse, did he mention Mari Sandoz and her friends going to Pine Ridge?
The question was the definitive author or biographer of Crazy Horse, Dr. Bray, did he mention Sandoz and Eleanor Hinman in his book? And I believe, yes, he did in the introduction. He didn't think too highly of Sandoz's take on Crazy Horse. I didn't mention that earlier. Eleanor Hinman, again, her friend that she traveled to the reservation with, she was working on a biography of Crazy Horse. Eventually, she gave up and gave all of her material to Sandoz, and Sandoz would write the biography of Crazy Horse. Sandoz never dedicated her works to anybody, except in this case. She dedicated Crazy Horse to Eleanor Hinman. But this Dr. Bray, he didn't think too highly of Sandoz's take on Crazy Horse.
Sandoz came up with a birth date of 1842 for Crazy Horse, but Kingsley Bray came up with 1840.
Sure.
And where you live, is it SHURTLEFF?
The question is, how do you spell the name of the apartment building here? And that's SHURTLEFF, Arms, Shirtliff Arms. So, very good. Yes, Mr. Ripley. Have I been in Mari's apartment, the actual apartment unit here, 402? No. Every once in a while, though, I get the courage and I walk upstairs to the fourth floor and I knock on the door, but no one ever answers. So, actually, I have pictures of Mari here in her apartment. This is 402, so we can go inside through the photographs. That's in her little dinette area. Those are the proofs of Slocum House sitting on her table. Again, this is taken in 1937, so Slocum House has just been published. And then here's another picture of Mari in her living room in Shirtliff Arms. There's more of the Slocum House proofs on the floor. So, yes. No, the question was she acquainted with Willa Cather. As far as we know, they only had one time of communication after Shadows on the Rock was published, 1931. Sandoz wrote this beautiful letter to Cather congratulating her on writing a true novel that wasn't just kind of insipid, silly stuff, which was kind of the trend in the 1920s. So she really liked Shadows on the Rock. And apparently Cather flipped the letter over and wrote, "Thanks, Willa," and sent it back to her. Something of that sort. So, but very good. Well, I see that we are out of time. Thank you so much for stopping by and stalking Ghosts of Mari Sandoz.